Hey, party peeps, and welcome back to Law and Candor. I am Bill. I am here with my co-host, Rob, and welcome back to another episode. Today, we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, the ever complex scope of privacy in the landscape or the wreckage of GDPR. Since the EU adopted GDPR about 6 years ago, the privacy landscape has only grown more complicated. Literally every day it's changing, not only in Europe, but now in the US with different states coming up with their own privacy laws and, obviously throughout the world. So today we were very lucky to have one of my favorite people at the company, Lighthouse's very own Sarah Moran. She is an e-discovery evangelist and a proposal content strategist. And she's going to help us make sense of all this, even the stuff that you can't make sense of with GDPR because it's changing every day. But before we get to Sarah, a conversation I think you will enjoy, we are going to dive into everyone's favorite portion of the program.
Sightings of radical brilliance.
And this, of course, is the part of the show where we bring to you the latest and greatest news of noteworthy innovation and acts of sheer genius. Roberto, what do we have for the people today?
Well, today's sighting comes from the New York Times. This is a February 16th, 2022 article called Google Plans Privacy Changes but Promises to Not Be Disruptive. And just to give you sort of an idea, this is really talking about the balance of privacy and then some of the effects that actually has on both, the people that are seeking privacy and those that are using information from smartphones and other things to drive things like ad revenue. This is interesting, I think, especially in that, what's happening is people are being given the opportunity to limit the extent to which, their data is collected and or shared. But that has real implications. It has implications, especially for people that are, using that information to target ads to us and to the companies that are, buying those types of services. Just very, very interesting.
It's funny, right? Because typically, so big government is getting involved and they're laying down laws here, even here in the US now, that were previously only tackled by Europe in terms of privacy. Like privacy didn't exist here in the US, let's face it, right? Not as compared to the almighty dollar. So that, capitalism triumphed over privacy, both in terms of generating revenue from it with your personal identifiable information and in litigation. Europe took the lead on it. We're going to talk about that with Sarah in a bit. But, now you're talking about just your PII that's being sold. And it's interesting because Apple and Google, who don't really make their money that way, not necessarily, right? They're trying to protect it a little bit more. And other companies that rely on that ad revenue that they're generating. I mean, you think about the micro advertising that you can do when you know everything about a person, as opposed to back in the day when it was just 17 to 29-year-olds watch this show, so play these types of commercials. Now you know what now they know what Rob Hellawell likes and how to advertise to you specifically, which is why when you decide you and your wife are going to go on vacation, your Instagram feed is full of Italy or with you, it's probably Azerbaijan because you like to travel to odd places, but you get my point. And if Apple and Google are going to cut down on sharing this information or what they collect, it's going to be interesting to see what downstream effects that has on revenue from companies that rely on the ad piece.
I'm all for having more privacy and for, people being able to opt in and out. But can we just agree it would be better to solve first the fact that anytime I look something up and buy it, I have to see ads for that for the next 3 weeks? It's like, I already bought it. Come on. There's got to be a way to track this.
Yeah, really. It's like, no, maybe you want more of this. It's an interesting article. It's interesting that Apple and Google are leading the way on this because it's not like, with that DuckDuckGo website, right? Where, everybody knows it exists, but nobody uses it because it doesn't collect any of the information or leave any cookies for anybody else to work off of. If this is Google and Apple doing it, other companies are probably just going to have to adjust. It'll be interesting to see how they do it because there's been an entire multi-billion, probably trillion-dollar economy built on getting ads off of the information that they collect from companies like Apple and Google.
Yep, I agree. All right, and next up, our conversation with Sarah Moran, who will take us through some of the changes to data privacy globally. We're excited, and we should all be paying attention to this.
Hello, Sarah. Welcome to Law and Candor. I think, as our listeners know at this point, with this season, we're celebrating Women's History Month and women in our industry. And you are a woman in our industry. One question we like to ask all our guests when they come on is, how did you find yourself here? Because nobody grows up and says to their kindergarten teacher, when I grow up, I want to be in e-discovery. So give us a little bit of background how you ended up here.
No, I did. I said that to my kindergarten teacher. No, thanks. First of all, thanks for having me. Longtime listener. I am really excited to be here, especially for Women's History Month. I love Lighthouse's initiatives around this month. So this is one of my favorites. As far as how I got into e-discovery, to be honest, I got into it because I graduated law school in 2008 and then the market tanked. So like within 3 days of passing the bar. So I was a contractor in the e-data practice group at Morgan Lewis in Philadelphia. And I was, working alongside people who were, graduated from Ivy League schools and had offers rescinded and deferred because of the crash. So I felt just lucky to have a job that paid the bills.
It's kind of like how I got my first prom date, actually. Like her first choice got the flu.
Yeah. I was like, yeah, all right, I'm here now. But it paid off. So, I started working my way up the ladder and I got hired as a staff attorney and then I got hired as an associate and I started getting more into information governance work. And, as the GDPR, there was like rumblings of this data protection law in Europe a few years before it was actually implemented. And there were these massive potential fines. And so a lot of clients wanted their doc retention schedules updated. They wanted to know what to expect. So then I started leaning into privacy and writing articles around the GDPR for the firm, helping with that type of work. And that thought leadership led me to Lighthouse as our e-discovery evangelist and proposal content strategist, which I love, but I know for a fact that most of my friends and definitely like my parents have no idea what I do. But I get to write every day about something that I've been love and have been doing for 10 years. And I get to come on podcasts and talk to you guys.
Yeah. And Sarah is someone that Bill and I both work with closely. It's exciting to have you here. And it's funny, you mentioned you kind of stumble into this privacy area, which I think in our industry is maybe one of the most difficult areas to kind of wrap your hands around. There's a lot of volatility, laws are changing domestically, they're changing internationally. Maybe we could just start with kind of the origin of a lot of our privacy laws, which is Europe. And could you just kind of give us an update on GDPR and what that means and kind of where enforcement is going there?
Yeah. I think the GDPR, it's just like it's constantly evolving. And 2021 was no different. There's been this continuous kind of uncertainty about how companies can transfer data from the EU into the US in a way that complies with the GDPR since the invalidation of the Privacy Shield in 2020. And so in that vein, I think one of the most impactful events in 2021 was the new standard contractual clauses. They were issued in June. And so with the Privacy Shield down, SCCs are one of the few mechanisms that companies can use to transfer personal data from the EU to the US in a way that complies with the GDPR. And so the new ones, any new contracts or processing transactions that take place after September 27th of 2021, they should be using the new SCCs now. And any new contracts that were entered in prior to that date, they have to update with the new SCCs by December 27th of this year. And the new ones do take into account kind of the decision-making behind the invalidation of the Privacy Shield, where like the old SCCs were a little bit more rigid. These provide a bit more flexibility. They're modular, meaning like companies can kind of choose from 4 different models. They expand the rights given to data subjects, and they mandate that data importers agree to EU jurisdiction. But I should point out that like there's still this uncertainty on what scenarios they're valid to use or when they're valid, especially for larger tech companies. So just this week, a major tech company warned that if it can't use SCCs, which some regulators in Europe have indicated that like SCCs don't provide an adequate level of protection. And if there's no new framework, like a new privacy shield, then it would have to halt its business in Europe. And so it'll just be interesting to see how that plays out.
And just when you thought that wasn't confusing enough, in the ultimate act of hubris, Prime Minister David Cameron a few years ago says, let's put Brexit to a vote. And
yes.
Everybody just goes crazy and haywire. And all the world has been a mess ever since over multiple reasons. So let's talk about that layer of complexity for businesses operating in the UK and Europe and how the UK's departure from the EU has impacted privacy compliance.
Yeah, I mean, that's like a good point, right? Is that like, if that wasn't enough, if there was like this level of uncertainty for the EU and the US, now there's this other layer of uncertainty for the UK and the EU. And this year it started out with what sounded like good news, right? in June, the EC adopted an adequacy decision or two adequacy decisions for the UK. So that allows for the free transfer of personal data, which was one of the primary concerns was like, how will we, what mechanism will we be able to use? Will they get an adequacy decision? They did. However, there's like a caveat that those decisions are kind of limited to this 4-year renewable period. And the EU indicated when it gave them those decisions that it will, like, that adequacy is going to be continued to be monitored throughout that period in case there's a divergence between EU and UK law, which I get indicates that it could be revoked, right? And so to further complicate that, then in September, the UK launched a consultation outlining its proposals to reform the UK's data protection laws. So like, it sounds like they want to become a little bit more business friendly and maybe deviate a little bit more from the GDPR. And if those new laws do deviate in like a significant way from the GDPR, then there's this concern that the EU may revoke the adequacy decision for the UK, which would then, I mean, theoretically put the UK back in the same position as the US, and that we aren't sure what mechanisms to transfer data between the two countries is, which is not ideal for the UK either.
And if that wasn't confusing enough in its own, on the other side of the pond, there was kind of a vacuum around privacy for a long time. And I think, people had hoped maybe the federal government would step in, but instead it's been the states that have stepped up. California was the first introducing the CCPA. But my understanding is that there's been a lot more state activity happening, and just curious if you could kind of give us the state of the state.
Yes. Without a federal law, as you said, I think that states just stepped up and did their own, and California led the way. By far the biggest news this year was the passage of 2 new GDPR-like laws in Colorado and Virginia that follow the California's model. They both go into effect in 2023, so there's some ramp time. Both are very similar to California's CCPA. They both give consumers the right to opt out of processing their personal data, the right to access it, delete it, correct it. Neither law currently provides for a private right of action, so they're enforced by the state attorney generals. Both are extraterritorial in their reach, meaning they don't just apply to companies located within the state. They apply to companies who conduct business in the state and meet certain other parameters. So I think we're just going to have to expect more of those laws in other states, especially if we don't see a privacy law anytime soon. In 2021, 25 other states introduced data privacy legislation or had legislation somewhere in the process. So this is just a trend we're just going to have to keep. It's not going anywhere. Companies are going to have to continue to deal with this patchwork of laws.
And Sarah, are any of those states, I don't know if you've seen all of the proposed legislation, but is anyone kind of breaking out of that GDPR type model and looking at different things?
Most are following, like the CCPA kind of model, which is modeled after the GDPR, but with that like US flavor of like not being as stringent as the GDPR.
GDPR with a twist of US.
Yes.
I think and you've indicated already that we don't. There's no reason to anticipate right now that the Fed's going to get involved here, and so that creates a problem for these companies that are operating. Forget about globally, right? That's just how do you begin? But even nationally now, if you're operating nationally in the absence of a federal law, is there a baseline that you can govern to internally? How do you build your compliance program around? Every state can try to not to coin a term here, but try to out liberal each other in terms of customer and individual rights around privacy. Yeah,
I mean, I think a federal law would certainly help, right? And I think like recent polling has shown that like U.S. citizens do want the majority of U.S. citizens want a federal law. It would help even with the GDPR level. It would probably provide like at least a further conversation about whether we provide an adequate protection from the EU's viewpoint. It would obviously make compliance in the U.S. more easier instead of dealing with this patchwork. But I mean, this is if we're talking like 2022, this is a midterm year. This administration seems like they have bigger fish to fry. We are clearly, I guess, not out of the woods with the pandemic. They're working on passing this other sweeping signature platform. I think it's more likely that the FTC is going to continue to just take this broader read on its role in enforcing data privacy. I think this administration is looking to kind of pump money into the FTC to do that.
And Sarah, with all these, different laws, starting to proliferate, if you're a business in the US, What do you do? Like how do you keep on top of this? And are you actually seeing that it's impacting organizations?
I think it's hard to see because so July of 2021 marked the first full year of enforcement under the CCPA, which is, where that's obviously the most like the forefront. That's the most stringent in the U.S. right now. And so we got a better picture then on how it was impacting but it's still kind of hard to see what the actual impact is other than like anecdotal, right? So that was the first time where we got some metrics. There was a small number of companies that meet the requirements to report metrics as far as like how many data subject requests did they get, like requests from consumers to remove data or get a copy of the data that a company's storing for them. Those requests can be burdensome and they're expensive because they only have a certain amount of time. Companies only have a certain amount of time to comply with them, and they have to comply. So from the information reported in July, after a year of enforcement from those few companies that have to meet the parameters to report, which was like 52 Fortune 500 companies, they collectively reported 4.7 million access requests, 4.3 million deletion requests, and 1.6 million do not sell requests. But even those metrics are like a little misleading because one or two companies could be receiving like a bulk of them. And it's not, like an average across all of companies. And those are very large companies who have to report. So we just don't concretely know how smaller companies are being impacted, like how many requests on average a company is getting. But I did see some data that suggested that it costs about $1,400 per request to respond to those types of requests. So obviously that adds up and can be pretty burdensome to smaller or mid-sized companies.
Yeah, I think, it's funny. If you go down to the DC area, you see those commercials like you used to see for those class actions for drug. Did you get a, heart valve replacement, or did you take this drug and end up, losing an arm or a limb, or, it's starting to see that around DSARs, right? Mm-hmm. Did you have your data with Marriott when they got hacked? And those commercials are starting to happen because these law firms are lining up to file DSARs for you in hopes that they'll get some big sanctions or whatever. And but again, I hate to do this, but we're talking about all this complex stuff and how difficult it's going to be to do business in, nationally and then in Europe and then with Brexit. What about beyond the U.S. and Europe? Now we get just globally. What are we looking for, especially when it comes to the future of privacy law?
Yeah, I think it's somewhat similar in that there's this patchwork of laws around the world. I think the biggest news outside of the US and the EU was China's new data protection law. That was passed. It's the Personal Information Protection Law, the PIPL, that was passed in August and then went into effect very shortly thereafter in November. Usually, we get these runways of time where you get a year or two. That didn't happen here. It's like the GDPR in that it's this, big comprehensive data protection law, and it says that it's aimed at protecting the personal information of people in China, and it, governs how companies collect and process and transfer data. But unlike the GDPR, it comes with the risk of being blacklisted by the Chinese government. And also, I think, possible criminal penalties, which is imprisonment. And it doesn't do anything to protect individuals in China from the Chinese government accessing and using their personal information. So kind of data privacy experts are saying that this regulation is more of a guise of the Chinese government, using it to increase their access and monitoring of personal data. And there's this concern that other countries in the region may follow that template. But right after it passed, or right after it was implemented on November 1st, on November 2nd, two major tech companies announced that they were exiting China. And they just cited, increasingly challenging business and legal environments. So that's something to keep an eye on and monitor it in 2022, like where that heads. And then just this patchwork of other data privacy laws. Japan is amending its act that will go into effect in 2022. Australia, India, Vietnam, South Korea, they're all either in the process of amending or reviewing proposed data privacy bills that could go into effect this year. So I think just going forward, having a DPO or someone in your organization or firm who can just stay on top of this kind of thing and this kind of always evolving landscape is just going to be increasingly important.
Yeah, no kidding. Like that's a lot of activity. Well, in light of Women's History Month, we wanted to just switch gears for a second. And Sarah, just curious, is there a tip or advice that you would give to other women in the legal and technology space to help them succeed or amplify their voice? And just really interested to hear what you would think about that.
Yeah, I love this question. I think my tip would be, find a mentor, find your support group, find your tribe. I've been really lucky to have women in leadership positions almost my entire career to look up to, which just speaks to how far I think we've come as an industry. And just hearing those women's stories of how hard it was to break into law or some of the challenges they faced early on in their careers because they were women, it's inspiring and it makes me feel really grateful. But, we always have further to go. And it's important to just kind of continue to have that representation in the industry and have other women to kind of celebrate with and look to for advice. So I would just say, look for those leaders, look for those mentors, look for those coworkers. And if they aren't in your organization, go outside of your own circle and look for them. Just because it's so important to have that circle. It helps us call out and amplify the successes and wins of other women.
Sarah, really great. You were great to have on today. I really appreciate you doing it. We, in terms of a key takeaway, it's such a complex area right now, and everybody's sort of struggling with it. And I guess what I see here is that there's essentially, if you're a company that does business nationally or even globally, you just have to have an eye on the ever evolving, to use your term, patchwork of laws that are evolving in this space as a means to comply with the rights of your customers. Is the only way to stay in compliance. And there's no secret formula. There's no magic bullet. It's just keeping on top of everything that's evolving as they come out, and as each state tries to outdo each other, and as as Europe evolves, you just have to keep an eye on it and make sure that you're in compliance. And I guess right now, you're just sort of hoping that if you fall out of compliance, you can catch up quickly before fines are levied. But it's incredibly complex. I do not envy the job of these officers in-house that have to try to comply from a global perspective with all these different laws. Hopefully there'll be at least a baseline soon. But for now, I think it's just keeping an eye on the patchwork and making sure that you're at least in compliance with the lowest common denominator or highest common denominator, depending on how you see it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah. You were awesome. We appreciate it.
Really appreciate it, Sarah. Thanks so much.
Thank you guys so much.
All right, party people. If you like what you're hearing on Law and Candor, I am coming to you once again to tell you to subscribe, unsubscribe, resubscribe, hit that like button, share it with all your friends. Listen 10 times. I don't know if we track that. Do whatever you need to do. We have some good content here. We enjoy doing the show. We want to keep doing it. Really appreciate it, everybody.